I don't know if this is the right place to say this, but it needs to be said. There's a story I've carried alone for years, one that doesn't make sense on the surface but is real nonetheless. It began with a phone ringing in the middle of the night, a call that should have been routine but wasn't. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but that didn't last long. What followed changed the way I think about time, danger, and what it means to intervene. The first call came just after midnight. The dispatch center was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the low chatter of my colleagues handling the usual emergencies. I answered the line, expecting the routine panic, confusion, or accidental misdial. Instead, there was only static crackling in my ear like a radio tuned to no station. Then a voice broke through, low, urgent, and almost drowned in the interference. "He's in the alley behind the corner store. Don't wait." I glanced around the room, assuming someone was playing a prank, but nobody reacted. The call ended before I could ask anything, leaving only that eerie silence that feels heavier than noise. I wrote it off initially. One odd call wasn't unusual in our line of work. People misdial, phones fail, or pranksters test the system. But as the week progressed, the calls became clearer and more specific. Each one contained instructions, warnings about crimes that had not yet happened but would within minutes if nothing was done. I remember one in particular. A man trapped in his car after an accident, with another vehicle approaching at high speed. I dispatched units immediately, heart racing, and watched as officers pulled the driver to safety just moments before impact. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I couldn't deny the pattern either. By the end of the second week, the calls began to include personal details about the victims that could not have been known to anyone else. Names, routines, small habits that only someone with close knowledge would know. One night, I heard a man's exact description as he walked his dog in the park, the caller instructing me to prevent him from crossing a certain intersection. I hesitated, but my instinct overrode doubt. The moment passed exactly as described. I started recording every call, every static-filled warning, cataloging them in a way that felt compulsive, obsessive even. It was as if the voice was compelling me to notice, to act. Sleep became difficult. I would lie in bed replaying the calls, listening for hidden details, tracing patterns that might tell me why this was happening. The dispatcher before me had often joked that we carried other people's lives in our hands, but now it felt literal, terrifyingly real. My colleagues noticed my distraction, the nervous tics, the way I jumped at every phone ring. No one knew what to say, and I didn't try to explain. There was no way to explain a voice predicting crimes before they occurred without sounding insane. The caller's instructions were never simple. They demanded precise timing, small interventions that had disproportionate consequences. One evening, I was told to call a man's workplace to warn him of a hazardous package arriving, vague enough to create anxiety, but specific enough to prevent a catastrophic injury. I complied, and he avoided the explosion that would have sent shards of metal into the office lobby. The surreal weight of responsibility made my hands shake. I realized I could not merely act. I had to act perfectly, or the outcomes could be disastrous. The more I obeyed, the more the calls escalated in intensity. They stopped giving gentle warnings and began to describe brutal outcomes, assaults, stabbings, murders that would occur in minutes. My stomach would turn, my pulse spike as I relayed information to officers, trying to keep the details intact while fighting the creeping suspicion that I was being tested. Each call left me drained, exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't repair. I started carrying a notebook with me even on my days off, sketching locations, noting times, and trying to anticipate the next warning. The line between work and life blurred. It was during one of these off-duty nights that I realized the calls were always coming from the same area code, one that didn't match any local number I recognized. I tried tracing it, but the signals bounced through anonymous networks, untraceable, as if intentionally masked. The operators at the telecom office shrugged at my questions. No one could make sense of it. And that's when I began to notice another pattern. The crimes were connected, not just random incidents. They formed a chain of cause and effect, escalating from petty thefts to violent encounters, all linked by timing, proximity, and circumstance. Someone, or something, was orchestrating them with a precision I could barely comprehend. My fear shifted from confusion to paranoia. I stopped walking alone at night, kept my apartment locked, and avoided public spaces. Every time the phone rang, my heart clenched. I even began noticing people I hadn't before, strangers on the street whose behavior seemed to align with the caller's instructions. One night, a man loitering near the subway stairs matched a description from a call I had heard days earlier. I froze, uncertain whether to intervene or wait, haunted by the dread that any wrong step could make the situation worse. The tipping point came 2 months in. A call arrived, longer than any before, filled with distortion and static, yet distinct enough that I could hear a single sentence clearly. "Next is you." My blood ran cold. I froze in the dispatch chair, staring at the phone as if willing it to stop. My rational mind rejected the idea that it was a threat I had to take seriously, but instinct screamed otherwise. I left the station, drove aimlessly through empty streets, and tried to convince myself it was a prank, a sick joke from someone with access to my work schedule. But the truth was worse than any joke could be. Someone knew me, my routines, and my vulnerabilities. I tried to rationalize the calls scientifically, psychically, technically any way I could. I contacted former colleagues, experts in telecommunications, and psychologists. Everyone had the same response: impossible to trace, no evidence of tampering, nothing that could explain predicting the future. The more I pressed, the more isolated I felt. My supervisor suggested I take a leave of absence, citing burnout. I refused. If the calls were accurate, leaving might mean someone died, and I couldn't reconcile that. I was trapped between fear and duty, suspicion and inevitability. By now, I was living in a state of hyper-awareness. Every sound, every flicker of movement, every phone vibration became a potential warning. I stopped trusting my instincts alone and began following patterns, mapping predicted incidents against real-world events. At first, it seemed mechanical, almost clinical, but soon I realized that each prediction had subtleties, nuances that only careful attention could decode. A shift in the caller's tone, a change in static pattern, a hesitated pause all mattered. I was no longer reacting, I was anticipating. And the anticipation was exhausting me, breaking down the boundary between my life and the emergencies I managed. The city itself began to feel smaller, as if the calls were folding space into a corridor I couldn't escape. I could walk streets without feeling relief, imagining the victims I had yet to save, or the ones who had slipped through my fingers. I began noting times, estimating probability windows, trying to see patterns that weren't obvious. Sleep became a tool, not a comfort, with alarms set every 30 minutes to ensure I didn't miss anything. My apartment became a war room, walls covered in notes and maps, every object a reminder of the next potential emergency. One night, I traced a call to a location just 3 blocks from my own apartment. The warning described a brutal assault, precise enough to be horrifying. Knife in the alley behind 5th and Elm, male, dark jacket, approaching from east. I froze. I knew the man, or at least I thought I did. The description fit me. My first instinct was denial, to laugh at the absurdity, but the weight of previous calls held me in place. My hands trembled, and I couldn't move, realizing for the first time that I was no longer just an observer or intermediary. I was part of the prediction. The next victim wasn't someone else. It was me. The static lingered in my ears long after the line went dead. I sat in the dark, heart hammering, trying to process the implications. The calls weren't just warnings, they were instructions, perhaps even commands. Every action I had taken had kept the chain intact, prevented outcomes that might have unraveled something larger than I could understand. And now, the chain had turned on me. I had to move, had to act, but I didn't know how to break the cycle without risking everyone else. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It was immediate, a living presence at my shoulders, whispering that the final act had begun. The next few days were a blur of hypervigilance and planning. I stopped answering any phone calls that weren't routed through the dispatch system. My work at the station became a blur, each shift punctuated by moments when I would freeze mid-task, listening for a static-laced warning that might never come. Every time the phone rang, I jumped, my pulse spiking, only to find routine traffic accidents or accidental misdials, yet the sense of inevitability never left me. I knew the call would come again, and when it did, there would be no warning, no margin for error. The thought that I could be next made even the simplest decisions feel perilous. I started sleeping at the station in short bursts, keeping myself tethered to the environment where the calls originated. I monitored the scanners constantly, trained my eyes on every incoming report, every dispatch request. I noticed small inconsistencies in patterns I had once ignored, realizing that the calls were evolving as my awareness increased. Each static-filled message became more precise, more insistent, leaving no room for interpretation. I was learning the language of the interference, the rhythm hidden within the crackle. It was exhausting, but necessary. One misstep could cost a life, and now it could cost mine. By midweek, I had begun to see connections I hadn't noticed before. The crimes weren't random, they were reactions, chains of cause and effect, each incident shaping the next. I traced a robbery in a convenience store to a later assault in a nearby alley. A small car accident led to a violent mugging. It became clear that someone was maintaining a timeline, one that depended on every detail being exactly as predicted. My fear shifted from self-preservation to understanding. If I could decipher the pattern, I might anticipate my own fate, and maybe even change it. I tried to share my discoveries with a trusted colleague, someone I had worked alongside for years. I explained the calls, the timing, the precision, and the inevitability that had taken hold. He stared at me, disbelief etched across his face. "You need a break," he said softly, but I could see the worry there too. I wanted to tell him everything, to make him understand, but I couldn't. Not yet. The calls didn't leave room for discussion or doubt. They demanded obedience. I feared that exposing them might break the chain in a way I couldn't predict. The voice returned that night, longer than before, its static-filled timbre somehow sharper, more urgent. "Alley behind 5th and Elm," it said, the sentence cutting through the interference with uncanny clarity. My chest tightened. I recognized the words immediately. They weren't hypothetical or abstract. They were instructions. The caller wasn't warning me. They were guiding me, orchestrating my movements, controlling the path I had to take. I packed a small bag, took only essentials, and left my apartment, following the route described. Every step measured, precise, fearful. As I approached the alley, I noticed small, deliberate signs along the way. A knocked-over trash can, a discarded glove, a shadow lingering too long. Each seemed to confirm the timeline. Each made me acutely aware that I was walking into a trap designed with intimate knowledge of my habits. My hands shook despite the cold, and every instinct screamed to turn back, to escape the inevitability of what awaited me. Yet I couldn't. The voice had made me complicit for months, and I had no idea how to step outside the pattern now. When I reached the alley, it was empty. The silence pressed down like a physical weight, punctuated only by the faint buzz of distant traffic. I checked the corners, every shadow, every doorway. There was nothing. I waited, counting seconds, listening for anything out of the ordinary. The fear became almost tangible, coiling tight in my stomach. I realized I was alone in this, dependent on instructions I could barely understand, with the knowledge that any deviation might lead to something catastrophic. Suddenly, movement caught my eye. A figure darted across the alley's entrance. I froze, unsure whether it was the predicted assailant or a bystander, and the voice returned in my head. Unspoken but unmistakable. Step aside. I hesitated, then complied, and the figure passed, disappearing into the night. The relief was immediate but fleeting, replaced by a gnawing realization. The caller had been orchestrating not just the warnings, but my reactions, my choices, my survival. Every move I had made, every intervention I had performed, had been under their silent guidance. The following days were a tense oscillation between vigilance and exhaustion. I barely ate, drank only coffee and water, and slept in short bursts. My personal life evaporated, friends stopped calling, family grew distant, and I accepted their absence as part of the necessary isolation. My world had shrunk to the dimensions of the calls, the city streets, and the maps I scrawled in the notebook I carried everywhere. I was a technician and a pawn at once, managing emergencies while being maneuvered by the unseen hand behind the static. One morning, the pattern shifted. A call came not for a stranger, not for a random victim, but for someone I had helped weeks earlier, a man whose life I had saved from a collision with a speeding vehicle. The static crackled, and I could hear him clearly. "You are next. The sequence depends on it." My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a prediction anymore, it was a confirmation. The timeline required my participation, and there was no safe way to avoid it. Panic and resignation coexisted in a tight knot inside me. I was part of the plan now, and I had to see it through. I tried to anticipate what that meant. Could I manipulate events, change the sequence without breaking the chain? Each scenario I imagined spiraled into further complications, each choice more terrifying than the last. I mapped routes, calculated timing, rehearsed contingencies like a military strategist. Nothing felt sufficient. The city itself became a grid of possibilities and consequences, each street corner a potential flashpoint, each pedestrian a variable in a system I barely understood. I was trapped in a lattice of human behavior and predestination, moving according to a rhythm dictated by someone or something I could not see. The day came when I received a call during my shift that left no room for hesitation. The static hissed, the voice commanded, and the details were horrifyingly precise. The location was one I knew intimately, the attack imminent and brutal, and the timing exact. I called for backup, tried to involve colleagues, but there was a realization creeping over me that made my blood run cold. No one could intervene fast enough, and no one knew the true nature of the threat. The voice had been orchestrating everything up to this point to ensure that the sequence would proceed exactly as planned. I followed the instructions to the letter, moving through the streets as though guided by an unseen hand. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to escape the inevitability of what I knew was coming, but I forced myself to comply. I reminded myself of all the lives I had saved, all the interventions that had worked because I listened, because I acted. Yet the certainty of my own vulnerability made the past week's accomplishments feel hollow. I was a spectator and a participant, bound to the chain I had tried to understand but could not control. By the evening, the tension had reached a breaking point. The streets were quiet, shadows stretching long under the flickering streetlights. I moved with careful precision, every step measured, every glance deliberate. The notebook in my bag held the sequence of calls, the patterns I had traced, but even with all that preparation, I felt exposed, aware that one misstep could be fatal. The city around me was familiar, yet alien, transformed into a grid of potential threats and warnings. I had become hyper-aware, trapped in a rhythm dictated by someone who knew me better than I knew myself. The final warning of Part 2 arrived with a clarity that made my pulse pound in my ears. The static crackled, the voice commanding, precise, unyielding, "Do not look back. The timeline depends on it." I walked forward, heart hammering, senses on edge, aware that what awaited me was no longer a question, but an inevitable conclusion. Every instinct, every ounce of awareness told me that survival would demand perfect obedience, that any hesitation might unravel everything. And as I stepped into the alley, I realized that the game had changed. I was no longer responding. I was being drawn in. The alley was narrow and shadowed, the buildings pressing close on either side. I moved slowly, deliberately, every sense alert, following the invisible cues I had come to rely on. The static hummed faintly in my mind as I traced the path outlined in previous calls, anticipating threats that might appear from corners, doorways, or even the darkness itself. I could hear distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, but the alley felt suspended in time, isolated from the city around it. My breath was shallow, controlled, each step a careful negotiation, with fear that clawed at my chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, but it wasn't what I expected. It was not a stranger, not a masked assailant, not even a person intending harm in the conventional sense. It was a man standing perfectly still, his presence commanding attention without movement. I froze, heart pounding, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with the instructions I had been given. The voice in my ear, or perhaps in my memory, was silent now, leaving me to navigate instinct and training alone. Yet every instinct screamed that this encounter was the culmination of weeks of orchestrated events. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes bore into mine with an unsettling intensity. In that moment, I understood that the calls had never been mere warnings. They had been guidance, manipulation, control. Every intervention I had made, every life I had saved, had ensured a sequence of events that had brought me to this alley at this exact time. I was no longer just an observer or a rescuer. I was the final variable, the one necessary element to preserve the timeline. My chest tightened with the suffocating realization that the voice had never intended to protect me. It intended to use me. I tried to retreat, step back, think of a way to break free from the chain, but my body betrayed me. My legs moved automatically, following the path mapped out in weeks of calls, guided by an invisible force I could not resist. Panic and dread collided with a numb, mechanical obedience. Every step felt preordained, as though I had been walking this path long before I even knew it existed. I glanced at the notebook in my hand, the pages covered with meticulous notes, and understood that knowledge offered no escape. Understanding the sequence was not enough. I had to fulfill it. The man stepped aside without a word, and I passed, moving deeper into the alley. Shadows shifted around me, faint movements suggesting figures I could not identify. The static returned briefly, a whisper, a reminder that I was being watched, guided, herded like the others I had helped save. The realization that my survival was never truly my own made my stomach twist. I had been complicit, a necessary actor in a pattern I could not disrupt, and now the sequence demanded its final act. Every choice I had made had led to this precise moment, and there was no alternative path. At the far end of the alley, I saw the object of the call, a man lying prone, motionless, in a pool of shadow. My training kicked in and I rushed forward, scanning for threats, assessing the scene. There was no immediate danger, no visible assailant, only the silent reminder that the timeline depended on intervention. My hands shook as I checked for a pulse, and when I found one, weak but steady, relief surged briefly before awareness returned. The sequence demanded action, careful, exacting action. and I had no margin for error. My compliance had become a survival mechanism, and the static whispered that the timeline was fragile. The hours that followed were a tense blur of reporting, coordination, and calculated decisions. I moved with purpose, relaying information, directing assistance, and anticipating every possible complication. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the previous weeks burned away, replaced by an exhausted hyperfocus. I understood that the timeline was not a suggestion, it was a contract, a set of imperatives I had unknowingly agreed to fulfill. My previous sense of autonomy had been an illusion, and the realization left me hollow, aware that even in my survival, I was still being directed, herded, controlled. In the quiet aftermath, as the scene cleared and emergency responders took over, I stood alone in the alley, exhausted and trembling. The notebook lay open in my hands, pages marked with observations, warnings, and predictions that had come true. I realized that the voice, the calls, and the timeline itself had never been about preventing harm. They had been about ensuring outcomes, preserving sequences, and using me as the final instrument to guarantee consistency. Every person I had saved, every intervention I had made, had been a thread in a web I could never untangle. The weeks after that were spent in an uneasy limbo. I returned to the dispatch center, but everything had shifted. The phone rang less frequently, or perhaps I ignored it, unsure if silence would preserve the timeline or break it. I walked through the city with a heightened awareness, noticing patterns and repetitions I could not ignore. Shadows moved differently now, street corners held new meaning, and every stranger could be part of the intricate chain I had come to understand. My life had narrowed to a constant vigilance, a watchfulness that blurred the line between duty and compulsion. Then, one evening, I received a call I couldn't answer. The static hissed, and through it I recognized the voice not commanding, not warning, but familiar in its insistence. "It's complete," it said, and the line went dead. No address, no instructions, no further intervention. I realized the timeline had achieved its necessary state, and my role, though survived, was nothing more than a witness to the order I had enforced. Relief mingled with an unsettling emptiness. I had survived, but survival felt irrelevant, overshadowed by the understanding that I had been manipulated into fulfilling someone else's design. I still carry the notebook, still replay the sequences in my mind, tracing the subtle orchestration that guided every step I took. The city seems smaller now, constricted by awareness of patterns and outcomes I cannot escape. I walk streets cautiously, observe faces with suspicion, and listen for static where none exists. The knowledge that I was never acting independently is a shadow that follows me, and I cannot shake it. The voice, the calls, the sequence, they were never benevolent. They were necessary, and I was necessary to them. I don't know if the next call will ever come, or if it already has, and I've simply failed to recognize it. I understand now that the voice was never warning me, never saving me, never offering choice. It was ensuring the timeline remained intact, and I was its final guarantor. Every life I saved, every intervention I performed, was part of a design I could not alter. I survived, but only by becoming what I feared most, a participant in something I could never control. Survival, I have learned, is not liberation, it is compliance. And compliance, when orchestrated by another, leaves no room for freedom.